the Toronto Star, I'm Sara Mojtehedzadeh, and this matters. It's called the billion-dollar scam by those in the know. It's been left to fester in Canada's trucking sector, and it has allegedly taken thousands of livelihoods and lives. A recent Star investigation has revealed a tangled thread of wage theft, threats, and intimidation, a systemic pattern of abuse within Canada's long-haul trucking industry. Long-haul truckers, the majority of whom are immigrants, have been filling thousands of complaints for years against unpaid wages and other exploitative and abusive behavior by the trucking companies that employ them. Experts are warning that it's risking not only livelihoods, but also the safety of the drivers and everyone else on the roads. Brampton drivers are finally mobilizing and fighting back very publicly and through social media. But they say they're facing repercussions in the form of lawsuits, defamation cases, and other intimidation tactics. The trucking companies mentioned in the Star investigation facing some of these allegations have denied any wrongdoing. Work and Wealth reporter Sara Mojtehedzadeh joins me now to talk about her investigation and explain what the stakes are in this mounting crisis. Hi, Sara. It's good to have you on the podcast again.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to dive right into it and ask you, what exactly is the billion-dollar scam, and how did that come to be associated with the trucking sector?
So the billion-dollar scam is referring to what some experts call Drivers Inc. And that is a model that is increasingly being used in the trucking sector, where drivers are told to, asked to, or ask to drive as self-incorporated companies rather than employees at a trucking firm. And what that means is that companies do not pay things like overtime. It means that they're not paying payroll taxes for their fleet. And where this becomes legally problematic is where the truck drivers don't have any of the traits of a truly self-employed individual. They don't own their own trucks. They have no negotiating power on the job. They don't control their working conditions. And that is why experts are calling it a scam, essentially. And they're saying that this model saves companies about $15,000 per worker. And if you multiply that by the number of trucking companies in this country, around 20% are believed to be using this Driver Inc. model. And that adds up to about $1 billion.
Mm-hmm. And in a way, you're saying that because of that sort of misclassification, these drivers are not getting the rights that a self-employed worker would be getting, and they're also not getting the rights that they might be entitled to as workers of a company, right? So there's kind of like this gray area.
So what misclassification is when you have been classified as self-employed when you are in fact an employee. So, a real self-employed person typically is someone who has quite a lot of power over their working conditions. They can do things like negotiate their own pay rates and set their own schedules, negotiate business deals with other companies. And those are the benefits, obviously, of being self-employed. If you are an employee, that means you are entitled to all of the protections in our labor laws. And so when an employer tries to classify you as self-employed when you're not, when you don't meet that legal definition of a self-employed person, it essentially puts up all these roadblocks to you getting those basic protections that you would have as an employee. Now, what I heard commonly from folks in the trucking industry is that when you use this Driver Inc. model, you're told as a driver, it's a win-win because you're going to get more money. We'll pay you a higher hourly rate. And so for some people, that's an attractive option. But the reality is that misclassification is illegal. If someone meets the definition of an employee, they must be considered an employee by the company. And the problem that is sort of at stake, and what we found is that there's very little proactive enforcement to ensure that companies are abiding by their obligations.
Right. I'm going to get into the details of that a little bit later as well. But I know that there was an illustration to sort of explain this in your piece. But for the purposes of this podcast, could you kind of explain that to us and give us an example or a model of what a typical Driver Inc. setup could look like?
Yeah. So the thing about Driver Inc. is that it's actually, if you kind of look at the numbers, it's fairly easy to identify. So essentially, every trucking company has to register the size of its fleet with the Ministry of Transport. It has to declare how many trucks it has. It also has to declare how many employees it has to the Workers' Compensation Board. So what you can do is actually just look at those two figures, and where you see a huge discrepancy, that might be a red flag that something weird is up. Like if a company has registered 100 trucks at the Ministry of Transport, but they've got fewer than 20 employees, it begs the question, who is driving all of those trucks, right? Like it's not physically possible for 20 people to be manning 100 vehicles full time. So that is typically what a Driver Inc. setup would look like. And what we found in looking at workers' compensation records and analysis that the Ontario Trucking Association did was that another feature of this model is that you could compare the number of collisions that these companies were reporting on the road and then look at their workers' compensation record, and there's no injuries accepted, which again begs the question, like, what happened in those accidents? Like, why aren't those drivers necessarily receiving workers' compensation if they get into an accident? And it raises a lot of questions about, again, like what protections and entitlements are these workers getting?
Did you speak to some of the trucking companies who've been allegedly involved in some of this? What kind of responses did you get?
I did. Some companies didn't respond to my questions, but others did speak to me. And, I thought it was quite interesting. Some of the companies felt that, they weren't breaking any laws and what they were doing was not illegal because, some drivers, they say, want to be classified as self-employed. And that may well be the case. But the point is that regardless of what a driver or a company wants to do, you have to abide by the law. And so that is really the concern from, advocates and experts, that essentially these laws around misclassification are being evaded. This story deals with hundreds and thousands of dollars of wage theft allegations. And, the companies who I spoke to all deny those claims. They say they don't owe workers money. And where there are disputes, they say, some companies say, well, workers should file a complaint with the labor board. And we sort of get into why for some drivers that route is very difficult and problematic.
Yes, we will get into that. And, you mentioned how one of the reasons being given is that some of the drivers agree to this kind of thing. How does the demographic or the kind of people who are in the trucking workforce, because you talk about a lot of newcomers, a certain demographic was there, how does that play a part in all of this? I would think that a newcomer would not be familiar enough with their rights or the rules here to be able to make that kind of empowered decision, right?
Yeah, and that's the real thing about misclassification, right? Like it's kind of a niche topic. I mean, most people don't know the legal definition of an employee versus an independent contractor or a self-employed person. I mean, that is legal knowledge that most people, plain and simple, do not have. And then when you look at Peel Region, which is one of the epicenters for trucking, 72% of this workforce is from an immigrant background. More and more workers are coming here through the temporary foreign worker program as truck drivers. Many are newcomers to Canada who came here as international students and might have, student debt that they're contending with. They might be supporting families back home, and people are often desperate for work. And that all factors in terms of, knowing your rights on the job. I saw one complaint under the Canada Labor Code where the worker said, I was given this thing to sign, I didn't know what it meant. I wasn't given time to read through it, and I didn't know what it was about. These are people whose first language isn't English. They don't have ready access to a lawyer. They might not be able to afford to hire a lawyer. And so there is a power imbalance there that I think is really important to think about when we're thinking about this issue.
We'll be right back. in terms of working conditions, this kind of gray area or this loophole that's being created allegedly, is that affecting the working conditions?
So, a thing that I heard repeatedly were the concerns around safety. So, we talked a little bit about the injury compensation, but one of the things that this investigation found was that companies that are using this Driver Inc. model are associated with higher rates of safety issues and violations. So we looked at a list of 150 trucking companies. Around 20% of those companies that were audited by the Workers' Compensation Board were found to have misclassification issues. They were sort of Driver Inc. models. And then when you look at that group of Driver Inc. companies, around 90% had some kind of safety intervention from the Ministry of Transportation. We also looked at 10 companies specifically in Brampton, many of whom were using the Driver Inc. model and all of whom were involved in wage theft allegations or pay disputes. And we found that their violations rate at the Ministry of Transportation was 6 times higher than the average Ontario trucking company. So there's the Driver Inc. side of the issue where the data and feedback from experts has consistently said, this is associated with poor safety outcomes on the road. And then there's the fact that this workforce is increasingly reliant on temporary foreign workers, on newcomers to Canada who may not have the ability to say no to unsafe work, or they're not being educated about their rights. And we went through one application from a temporary foreign worker who actually applied for a work permit from the federal government alleging abuse. And his allegations included things like he was being told to falsify his electronic log of how many hours he was on the road, to use different names so that it wouldn't look like he was violating the law on how much time he was spending on the road, which is obviously extremely dangerous, that he was being asked to pay for truck repairs with his own credit card. And those are the power dynamics that using a vulnerable workforce sets up.
And I do want to come to how there is now pushback against all of this. But first, this is very dangerous, like you said, for both the workers involved in the operation, but basically everyone on the road, because we keep hearing these reports of horrible accidents. And according to the OPP, truck accidents are up by 40%. So this is essentially a risky situation for everyone.
Yeah, I think, again, like we've talked about this so much during the pandemic, that the conditions of work are the conditions that like all of us ultimately have to live with, right? We talk about that in long-term care, that the conditions of work are the conditions of care. And I think that a lot of the advocates and experts that I spoke to really said the same thing about trucking. It requires a lot of training and support to make sure that this job is safe and that everyone on the road is safe. And when you have a workforce that may be being exploited, corners are going to get cut in other parts of the operation as well. That's the fear. Some of the drivers I talked to spoke of finding their job on Kijiji, not receiving training, appropriate training. These are all things that put everyone at risk, regardless of, how hard the driver may try to stay safe. If you're being told, to violate how long you are on the road for, violate the legal rules around how long you're on the road for, like that's the problem.
Right. And some of the pushback, like I mentioned earlier, is being seen quite publicly around this. Could you talk to me a little bit about the sort of campaign that's building up around it? And in that context, you also talk about Arshdeep Singh, who's had lived experience of this and is sort of one of the more known figures of this campaign, right?
Yeah, so Arshdeep is a member of the Nojwan Support Network, and this is a group of workers based primarily in the Peel region who have really been mobilizing around the issue of wage theft. And Peel, with a workforce that is largely in precarious jobs, it's a region that is really having to confront these precarious working conditions. And again, the pandemic has really exposed those fault lines. And, this network was really born out of, it was actually a group of folks who had sort of come together around the farmers' protests in India and sort of, staging sort of solidarity protests here in the Peel region. But out of that organizing, people started to realize that they often shared this issue in common, that they were in these precarious conditions, they weren't getting paid, and it was incredibly stressful. And, we've seen international students, unfortunately, take their own lives because of those enormous financial pressures and psychological pressures that these working conditions create. And this movement really was born out of that and a desire to kind of come together and do something about it. And obviously, you can see in our investigation, their tactics make some of these companies very uncomfortable, because it is about public protest and it is about making public demands around allegations of unpaid wages. But I think on a bigger level, it's about just coming together. And precarious work is very lonely. That's something that I hear repeatedly on my job. And this is sort of seen as an antidote to that.
What sort of tactics are being reported from the company's side? From what I was reading in your piece, from people's testimonies, there seems to be some kind of legal blowback or a concerted sort of effort to intimidate through legal means and other means as well. Is that something that was observed?
So again, a lot of the companies at the center of these wage disputes do not like that workers are protesting outside their homes or their businesses when they've claimed unpaid wages. To many employers, they see that as unfair attacks on their businesses. They want workers to go through the formal channels. They want them to file complaints under the Canada Labour Code. But the reality is, I've reviewed a lot of the documentation in these cases. First of all, the employers at the center of these wage disputes are always given private opportunities to pay up first. So the network will always send them letters and ask that they pay up in the dispute first. And then when that fails, it's sort of only when that fails that it becomes public. But equally, a number of the truck drivers who have been involved in these protests have won their cases at the labor board. The federal labor program has ruled that they are owed money. And, the process is so long that sometimes they're waiting years. The pay disputes go back to 2019. And so I think that these protests are an expression of that frustration, in the sense that the formal channels that exist to recover workers' wages aren't working for them, and that another way is necessary.
And, you talked about how a lot of the workforce in this industry is comprised of immigrants and newcomers. They might have student debt or they need to send money back home to their families. And there's this one text exchange between a truck driver, Manocha, and the employer that I helped you translate. The desperation in it and the lack of response from the other party, it really stayed with me. Can you tell me a little bit about that exchange and Manocha? I think it's a perfect example of what a missed check or missed payment could mean for someone like that, right?
So yeah, his story is that he found this trucking job on Kijiji, started working during the pandemic, and checks started being late or missing, and he submitted the text exchanges with his employer through a complaint that he would eventually file. But they go on for weeks and months. Please, can you send me my check? I really need the money. He was sending money back home to support his family. He needed to pay rent, he needed to pay grocery bills, and you can really feel the desperation. And, he ultimately did win his complaint, but he has still not received the money. He has been sued for defamation by a former director of the company. And I found several other cases of trucking companies filing defamation suits after public demands or protests were organized demanding unpaid wages. And, it's a very difficult situation to be in, because first of all, you're trying to recover the $10,000 that you're owed, and then to deal with the legal wrangling that comes afterward. Drivers told me that they feel that it is an attempt to silence them and to dissuade them from seeking the money that they say they're owed.
And just the emotional and psychological sort of impact of that, which was quite visible in those texts, as well as he was again and again trying to just get a response, on his wages. What about any oversight or regulation? Is there any in this industry? How does that work? And how is this happening at this scale, if there is such a body?
Yeah. So truckers who travel across Canada or across North America are regulated by the federal government. They fall under Employment and Social Development Canada. And there are laws around misclassification. That's actually something that the Liberal government did bring in. They made it explicitly illegal and they established a penalties regime. Of course, not paying your workers has always been illegal, and companies have always been required to ensure that if someone is self-employed, that they meet the definition of actually being self-employed. But the Liberals did strengthen measures on that front. But what we found through our investigation was that truckers far and away are filing more complaints than any other sector. They've filed 12 times the number of wage violation complaints, 4,800 of those complaints over the past 3 years. There have been almost 1,000 orders to pay issued to trucking companies for wage violations. Again, that is far and away just blows away the number of orders issued in other sectors, which really indicates a significant problem with non-compliance. So none of this is a secret. It's well established that this is happening. But since that new fines and penalties regime came in earlier this year, there haven't been any issued to trucking companies for wage violations. The government's conducted fewer than 100 workplace inspections for wage issues in trucking over the past 3 years. This year, they've only done 25 inspections. So the concern from a lot of experts and advocates is that this has been allowed to fester for so long that it's become normalized. And the government has not stepped up to proactively make sure that these issues are being dealt with and that companies are abiding by their legal obligations. And, I heard that frustration across the spectrum, right? Like I heard it from truck drivers who are saying, like, it's all on me. If I'm not being paid, I have to file a complaint. I have to wait several years to get the money. I have to wait for the government to enforce the payment order. And on the other side, trucking companies who are abiding by the law are saying, well, I'm being undercut. I can't compete with a trucking company that isn't fulfilling their legal obligations because they can offer way cheaper rates to Walmart and, Metro and all these big companies. And so they see it as really unfair as well.
Right. And I've seen you cover these stories over the past 2 years, whether it's Amazon warehouse workers or food delivery couriers. It's the same story. And I think it says a lot about the inherent nature of this kind of precarious work, especially in this pandemic and this economy. So it's something to think about and learn from, I hope. Thank you so much, Sara, for your work on this and for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
I was speaking to the Star's work and wealth reporter, Sara Mojtehedzadeh. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sara Mojtehedzadeh. The This Matters team is Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Muther, and Sean Pattenton. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.